Well, you're very lucky. I'm back, and I have unlimited time.
It's always a pleasure to see you.
So let me think about this and keep this thing going, because we do want to conclude our hearings here shortly. But I might get more specific on some of the questions I talked about earlier, having to do with, say, the international events. I've been particularly interested in that, and we do repeal that provision in the code that says that you aren't responsible for telling us about that. Now, I'm sure you think I've overstated this position about when the Federal Reserve gets involved in agreements with other central banks and other governments. Why doesn't that borderline along the line of having a treaty or an agreement and being allowed to finance that outside the appropriation process?
Well, we are not, I think it overstates what the Federal Reserve does. We set up accounts with foreign entities, foreign central banks, to allow them to conduct their business in the dollar. So there's dollar reserves that foreign countries have. Sometimes foreign countries buy U.S. government securities. They need a place to deposit their securities and the interest that comes from the securities. That's not providing financial assistance to foreign governments. We're simply acting as a normal bank.
But indirectly, wouldn't it be if you have a guaranteed loan, even though you might not say it's literal financing, but if you guarantee something, they agree to do something. What if you want them to intervene in the currency markets? You might ask them to do that, wouldn't you?
That is an aspect under the responsibility of the Treasury. That's not the responsibility of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, but I think you work rather closely. You're both on the President's Working Group on financial markets, so you collude there on what you might do. Are you aware of any precise times that the Federal Reserve gets involved in the in the gold market? Because actually there's authority in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, at least, to be involved. But what do you know about the Fed ever being involved in the gold market, whether it's the futures market or loaning gold? Because a lot of central banks are in the loaning and selling of gold constantly.
And we, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, is a trustee for some of the gold stock of foreign central banks. It holds the gold, but it doesn't conduct transactions itself in that gold. That's done by the foreign central banks.
But you don't think, you have no evidence that our Federal Reserve has ever been involved in the gold market?
So I confess not to being an expert in transactions we might have done in gold over the history of the Federal Reserve, but we could get you that information.
Of course, what I'm suggesting, the reason for the audit is to find out whether indirectly we might be involved by going to another central bank or a government and doing the work that we want to do, and that's why I think the full audit is necessary. And I believe we have had the return, and I'm willing to yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Grayson from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Alvarez, has the Federal Reserve ever tried to manipulate the U.S. stock market?
No, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of, but you're the attorney, right?
That's right.
So you might not even know, right?
I would expect to know if there were something like that being done. I'm not aware of that at all.
And if you did know, you'd be bound by attorney-client privilege, and you wouldn't be able to tell us, right?
Sir, if there were something the Federal Reserve were doing outside its legal authority, I would have an obligation to say something about that.
All right, so we agree that any participation by the Federal Reserve in the stock market or the futures market is outside the Federal Reserve's legal authority, right?
The Federal Reserve has some authority to regulate various aspects of markets and participate in markets in certain ways. So I think your question is too categorical, but...
I think not, actually. Why don't you answer it?
I don't know. Your question is so overbroad, I don't know where to begin to answer that.
I don't think it's that overbroad. I'd like you to tell me whether it's within the Federal Reserve's legal authority to try to manipulate the stock market or the futures market.
So I don't believe the Federal Reserve tries to manipulate the stock market or the futures.
Come on.
No, so...
Do they?
The Federal Reserve's obligation and what it does in monetary policy is try to influence interest rates, and in that way to maximize employment and to stabilize prices.
Now, if in fact the Federal Reserve were trying to do that or doing it, isn't that something that we'd want to know?
And To the extent that the Federal Reserve influences interest rates, it does make announcements of that decision immediately.
That's
It
not what I
makes-
said. I
It
said
is. You
manipulate
said,
the
"Wouldn't
stock
you wanna
market or the
know?"
futures market. Wouldn't we want to know? Yes or no?
Could you define what you mean by
I
the-
think you know what I mean, Mr. Alvarez. Now, wouldn't it be very helpful to have a GAO audit on that subject? Wouldn't it?
I don't know what it is that you're seeking to audit, sir.
What
It
I
would
just
be
said.
helpful if you could
Let's go on
outline
to
your
something else.
specific
Does the
question.
Federal Reserve actually possess all the gold that's listed on their balance sheet? Do they actually possess it?
Yes.
Has that been audited by the GAO?
I believe that's within the GAO's authority to audit. It certainly is something that our independent accountant is able to verify and does.
So if I go ahead and ask for a GAO audit, you won't oppose it, right?
To auditing the presence of the gold on the facility, I don't see any reason to object to that.
Good. Now, there's been all sorts of claims of insider trading and front running by the people who execute the trades for the Federal Reserve in the market. By the way, who is that? Who actually executes the trades for the Federal Reserve in the markets?
I haven't heard of any allegations of front running.
Well,
or
that's funny
improper
because you're the
trading at
general
all.
counsel, so if
The,
anybody would know about it, you'd think you would know about it.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is responsible for affecting the transactions implementing monetary policy.
Okay, so then answer the question.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's your answer?
You wanted to know who implements
You have people sitting in
conducts the
screens at the Federal Reserve Bank
transactions.
actually executing those trades. You don't delegate that to anyone else?
No, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of course, it's a process where there's several steps. Federal Reserve Bank of New York executes transactions through primary dealers. who deal with the
Okay.
broad-
Who are the
broader
primary
market.
dealers?
So the list of primary dealers is on our website.
Do you know any of them? Can you name a single one?
Sure.
Name one.
JPMC.
Go ahead, what?
JP Morgan Chase.
Okay. Do you mind if we have a GAO audit to see whether there's been front running or insider trading by them? Do you mind? Is that okay with you?
I'm not sure I have any decision-making authority.
Well,
here,
you're the
but
general counsel. I want to know if you're going to try to stop it.
GAO audits government agencies, you want an audit of a private entity. I think that's something that Congress would have to change the authority of the GAO to allow.
All right. Now, let's say, you're right, that's what we're doing right here, by the way. Let's say that the Federal Reserve gave $1 billion to a very promising fledgling institution called the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan, whose only asset is an unnumbered Swiss bank account. Don't you think it would be a good idea to have the GAO have authority to look into that?
So under the GAO authority as written, a loan by the Federal Reserve to a specific entity, say a particular bank, as you've pointed out, would be subject to GAO audit. We don't oppose that.
All right. Now, the Federal Reserve has given $1 trillion out. $1 trillion in the past 12 months. That's how much the increase in its assets and liabilities in the balance sheet has been. Who got the money? This, by the way, is a question sent to me by Beatrice Delgado. She just wants to know who got the money. Will you tell me?
So the most of the increase in our balance sheet has been the purchase of U.S. government securities and the purchase of agency guaranteed securities in the open market from market participants broadly.
And what about the rest of
Gentleman's
it?
time has expired.
All right.
The
Thank you,
gentleman has
Mr. Chairman.
additional
But I really
questions.
think we need answers to these questions, and the only way to get answers to these questions is to have the GAO audit the Federal Reserve. Thank you very much.